Welcome to Meadowlarkers 37. I'm Kate Fagan here with Howard Bryant and Amin El Hassan. It's not 37. Howard's
38.
shaking his head. 38. I can't sell us one short, the sweat and love that goes into each one of these. All right, Meadowlarkers 38. And as you heard, just my voice at the top of this episode telling the story of the FA ban, the Football Association ban in England. And guys, I felt like that was a good jumping off point to a much broader question about our sports because with the FA ban and the story of women's soccer in England shows us is that the evolution of sports, whether among genders or between sports in different countries, there's always factors that either history overlooks or that we don't always on the day to day think about when we think about why our sports are the way they are. And I think of that being from country to country. Why are some sports popular in some countries and not others? Or I mean, we go all the way back to when Naismith invented basketball, and he kind of takes what's handy and he's like, okay, I got a peach basket and I got this like leather ball here. And if he had had different props close to him, would we see a different evolution of basketball? So I think it's a good jumping off point. And Howard, I'll start here with you. When you think about how and why, even if we take geographically, our sports have evolved, where does your mind go?
Well, first for me, the mind always goes to money and necessity. I remember when I was at Spanish language school in Guatemala, in Antigua, Guatemala, in the late '90s. They always used to refer to soccer as the sport of kings, and I just figured it was a sort of chauvinism because soccer is their game down there. But one of the things that had been explained to me was it wasn't just the fact that it's the most popular game. It was also out of necessity, no overhead. And these are the things that immediately sort of draw us to a certain sport, the accessibility to play it, the culture of it, but also how you eventually get priced out of it. I always think about it when you think about baseball, is that that's one of the games where at one point was the poor people's sport, just like basketball and football and soccer especially. And then now it's the expensive sport, where you just saw Deion Sanders give an interview the other day talking about how baseball has priced people out. And when I think about the piece, it's the same thing. It's a reminder. I mean, think about how different women's sports and women's soccer would have been had it been encouraging. You think about the my friend Glenn Stout did a book on the great swimmer Gertrude Ederle, and there's a movie coming out. Daisy Ridley is going to be Gertrude Ederle. The reason why we talk about her, not because she swam across the English Channel, but it was because the girls were taught how to swim to save their own lives. This was the first, when you put women in the water, it wasn't for sports. It was out of necessity because of a terrible, terrible accident. And then people had to learn how to swim. So once again, the necessity is what drives the sport in almost every case, and the money, of course.
Yeah, I think about it's funny, Howard. I went to the same place. I was thinking about soccer, and it's Pele talks about we grew up playing soccer. They didn't even have a ball. They made the ball out of like rolled up socks or stuff. They put some rocks in there, roll up socks, and then you learn to play with that. And if you basically have a ball-like substance, that's all you and expansive space. That's all you really need. Brazilian players often credit like having to play in really either on the beach where the sand is not uniform, or in like vacant lots where there's rocks and all sorts of other hazards, and they credit that to giving them the amazing ball control and deft touch, because they're used to the ball having such random bounces. Yeah, so you just have to be that precise with everything. And so, as people wonder how things end up being what they are, like what training do you guys do? Okay, it's not any of that. It's just because you had to, because this is how it is. Basketball players who grew up in northern cities with inclement weather, Think about Chicago, think about New York. Oh, what do they go to the hole, right? The dribble penetration, the ability to get to the rim and finish. Why? If you're shooting jump shots, the wind's going to blow it, right? So a lot of things happen, not, as Howard said, not because somebody planned it or made a conscious decision to say, you know what, we need our players to be great at getting to the basket. It's because it's just out of necessity of, man, if you're going to sit around and shoot a jump shot playing outdoors, the ball's going to get blown this way or that way. Kate, to your point, Naismith put it up 10 feet high because that's where the thing was, like in the auditorium. It was 10 feet high, and that's where he put the beach basket. It wasn't, there's nothing.
Could have easily been
There's no
11
scientific,
feet.
exactly. Could have been 11
He
and a half,
wasn't
12,
thinking
or
about
9.
dunking then.
Right.
Well, and just imagine back then people weren't they weren't as tall as they are now. Imagine if it stayed at 8 foot, an 8 foot rim, the whole game changes. And to Kate's point, there's something else here too that I think is really important. It's not just the necessity and the money of the sport. It's also the political decisions that are made about who gets to play and who doesn't. And I think that's what the piece really sort of emphasized, is these decisions are being made by people. And those decisions are going to determine what sports get played and who gets to play them. And I also think about the idea of, okay, well, who do we want to play? This always takes me back to tennis, my favorite sport, one of my favorite sports. One of the things that people have always said about tennis in the open era, that one of the reasons why Arthur Ashe is the biggest tennis stadium in the world, with 24,000 seats, is because a lot of the old, white, private country clubs didn't want to integrate. They didn't want the great unwashed at their gorgeous little clubs. And so that forced actual stadium building. And so when you think about, if you've ever been to like one of the classic, if you've ever been to the Tennis Hall of Fame in Newport, or if you've ever been to, even like Wimbledon, for example, if you've ever been to one of these classic country club spots, like where they, have the golf tournaments, it's gorgeous. It's not a super rowdy sporting event like you're going to a football game. But the money people didn't want the proletariat walking into their precious little venues. And that changes the environment of the game as well.
Yeah. Because I think, Howard, what you and I were talking about even offline is when I was younger, when I would just casually look at our sports, I would wonder why so many sports, quote unquote, invented in America had been proliferated across the world in a way that wasn't necessarily reciprocated. And obviously, like initially you're just thinking, oh, well, culture, like our music goes everywhere, our inventions go American inventions go farther. But then I was like, well, why what seems to be a very niche sport like baseball originally, that could have just stayed a domestic game, and yet it spreads across the world, but football doesn't spread across the world in the same way. So it's like there's some of it is that, as Howard, as you said, like that kind of colonialism and the colonizing, it's war. Yeah. But then there's also something, or maybe you have an answer to this, where it's like, obviously football is a harder game to transport because it is not transported as well as other games that quote Americans have invented.
Yeah, it's war. I mean, that is the biggest thing. The United States occupies the Philippines. The United States occupies Japan. What do they play? Baseball. That whole region plays baseball. And the reason why they play baseball is because of the huge American influence over there, because of the geopolitics. The same is true for the Dominican Republic. The same is true for Cuba. And then you cut the Dominican Republic in half, and they don't play baseball in Haiti because of the French influence. And so much of the colonialism, so much of the games that get transported, it's all a byproduct of war. You're wondering, okay, well, why didn't football or baseball translate to the Netherlands? Well, they've got their own games over there. They're playing soccer and they're speed skating and they're doing what they do. But yet then you go to a colonial property of the Netherlands, Curaçao, tons of baseball players. You've got Andrew Jones and Xander Bogaerts and the rest of the players down there. So it's so many of these factors determine. And what we do in the United States, of course, is we assume, because we've got such a huge footprint, that because it's ours, everybody wants it. And it's really not, that's really not the reason. One of the things that does sort of jump out to me when we talk about this, though, is the Dream Team. That, as a phenomenon, is purely American economic power advertising based. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and the National Basketball Association, along with Gatorade and Michael Jordan. This, in a lot of ways, you can talk about the Dream Team. And I remember I was 19 when the United States got the bronze in '88. That was the first big thing, which was like, we have to let the pros play, and we can't let Oscar Schmidt run all over us, right? You can't let this happen. But the real driving factor was the economics, was the global impact of the American corporation, which really drives the Dream Team. You can take it one of two ways or combine them. You can say, yeah, well, we got embarrassed in '88 in Seoul, or you can say that American corporations were like, you know what? This is a very ripe opportunity for all of us.
With the export Americana, pure and uncut, to the masses, get them hooked with a little free sample in Barcelona. Next thing you know, they're coming back for more and more.
But I mean, isn't that sort of wild, though, that when you think about it, like, what do we always say our biggest export, not our export, what do we say our biggest thing is in this country? It's football. NFL Europe never translated. It does. Nobody else plays football around the world. They try. It doesn't work. They try to play, games over in London. There's no huge groundswell request for the NFL over there.
You know why?
Okay.
You know what my theory is?
Go for it. All right.
What
I have an
the
answer.
theory? I want the theory.
Branding. If it was named anything else, it would have had a chance.
Because it's called football, and they call it football.
It's called football.
They are so protective of that word. They like football? No, you can't call it that. Imagine if someone created a sport that very tangentially included at some point a basket and said, we want to play basketball, and then try to make it a thing here. Wouldn't fly, because people would say that's not basketball. The branding,
Try
I think,
using
of
the
football.
word soccer in Europe, and look at the face.
Yes,
look at their faces.
Which is always funny, because the word soccer came from England. They were the ones that came up with it, because the SOC in association football, SOC is the little nickname soccer. It's their word. But because...
Oh, I never knew this. This is great.
Yeah.
This is like my Girl Friday.
Just gonna see your Girl Friday. There it is.
Okay. I've never looked up the origin of the word soccer. So thank you, Amin.
No problem. But
See the things you get in the Meadowlarkers.
Yeah, that's right.
It's hilarious that it doesn't translate, because I think first and foremost there's just an instant resistance to you guys using the word football to describe this thing where they barely use their feet. How much sense does that make? And then, because here's the thing, rugby is very popular in Europe.
Yeah.
So but
that's also part of it, right? They already have their version of football.
Yep.
Do you think there's anything, and I'm just thinking on my feet here, it's not as if I've like thought this through for years, but there is a fluidity and a natural understanding when you talk about soccer. You're like, okay, basically you had a ball and you were like, what if we didn't use our hands? And then this game sort of evolves from there. And you could see something similar in other games. Is it possible that one element of why football doesn't translate necessarily very well to other countries is because there is no linear thinking about why there's nothing intuitive about it whatsoever?
It's all the above. It's the fact that Amin makes the great point that the branding is wrong. The currency, the actual units of measure are wrong. We use feet over here. And we use feet in yards. Mm-hmm. They use meters. So that doesn't translate. Trying to explain football to someone that doesn't know football. Have you ever tried to explain football?
That's what I mean.
Right?
At least in soccer, you're like, look, you're trying to get it into that goal. And you're like, okay, the nitty gritty, I'll get into it as I watch more. But football?
This is the thing about football, association football, soccer, right? What are the rules? 1, can't touch it with your hands unless you're a goalkeeper. Okay. 2, hey, if the guy if your offensive player is behind the last defensive player and they pass the ball to him, he's offside.
And you can't tackle somebody.
3, like the way you tackle is it's a specific way. Other than that, that's the game.
Yep.
Now think about football's rules. Well, this guy's the only guy who can throw it, and that guy's not eligible to receive it, but that guy is. But he can't take a step over here. Also, by the way, you can't do this. Like, it's nothing but rules.
You can't pass it backward. You have 4 downs. Why do you have 4 downs? I mean, it's just.
You gotta go 10 yards. And what happens if there's less than 10 yards? Well, then you just have 4 downs to get it past the goal line. If you get past the goal line, you can either kick a point after that, or maybe you can. It's insane. And so that's another thing I think that stops it. That's the reason why soccer is so popular world over, because A, the equipment, you barely need a ball, right? You just need a round object and some space. B, the rules, pretty simple. And if you're playing pickup soccer, no one's calling offside, so that complicated rule goes out the window, right? And there you go. Just go ahead and play. Football, I need this, I need that. It's so much that it does not lend itself to being very accessible.
And doesn't that have a whole lot to do as well with rugby? You ever watch a rugby game? I'm like, this looks like kids at recess. Guy has ball. Right? Mm-hmm. They make wall, guy falls down, they put the ball on the ground, and they get up and go after each other again. It's like, okay, when's lunch? Right? I mean, it doesn't look that structured. I do not mean to offend our European brothers out there who love rugby. I'm just saying, but when you look at how rigid American football is, they look like night and day, and they are actually somewhat similar. But you can't make a forward pass in rugby, right? You got to do laterals to get the ball downfield.
Yeah, but there's something about the continuous flow of
exactly, Kate, but that game actually has more of a flow than
sense.
American football, because you're not always resetting. In football, American football, you are constantly resetting.
Yep. It reminds me of those dances, and they've got the men on one side and the women on the other side, and they kind of strut up to each other, and then it's a very choreographed dance. In the movies, it's always at a ball or at a wedding or whatever, and I just how did everyone know? Yeah. How does everyone know? Do they practice this on their off time?
Yeah, you know what though too? The other piece of this, and the branding is interesting because they do play some baseball in the Netherlands, but it's not even called baseball. It's called honkball. And so
rounders.
It's rounders.
That might also be poorly branded as well.
Yeah, I'm like, what is honkball? There's no honking in this game. Where's the actual honk come from?
It's funny. Because some might call baseball honk ball here. Cut that.
Hey, you know what? The game is down to 7%, but the large number of Latinos in the game keep it from being honky ball.
Well, what do we think about too? Because if we drill down even further about soccer, and to both of your points, and I mean you can. Basketball the same way. I mean, most of us grew up and rolled up a pair of socks and had a Nerf hoop, and that's all you needed to mimic what you were playing. So it's all across the world. Soccer is a sport that is accessible regardless of class in most places, because you can just have a bunch of rubber balls, like you said, Amin, and there's your soccer ball, and you just need a dirt field.
And you need 4 T-shirts to make 2 goals. There you go. That's it.
Howard, when I was a kid growing up in Sudan, sometimes you didn't even do that. Just a pile of dirt. Cone of dirt here and a cone of dirt here. There's your goalpost.
That's right. Yeah. And what's funny about that is that when I was down in the Dominican Republic, they play baseball barefoot on a dirt infield.
Me too.
And a dirt outfield.
Yep. Broken glass in my left foot.
Whoa. I'm looking at this going, damn. But once again, there's no overhead. When we growing up in Boston, you play basketball, you take a milk crate and you nail it to the phone pole. No overhead and a ball, and that's that.
So how does a sport that inherently has no overhead in the U.S. become a pay-to-play sport with one of the highest overheads of any sport that we play here?
One word.
I mean, go for it.
Capitalism.
Well, and to Kate's point, to start this entire program, the decision has been made, right? Who's going to play the game? And when you decide that suddenly we're going to create barriers to entry, now you get a different person playing the game. when we're going to decide that I remember Jimmy Rollins when he was with the Phillies talking about how one of the reasons why people didn't play, why baseball was declining, is because baseball is a father-son sport, and baseball is not an inherently pickup game sport. You have to be taught baseball. And as much as I agreed with some of that, I mean, tennis is very similar. There's very little pickup tennis. You have to be taught how to swing a tennis racket. That doesn't, you just don't show up and swing a racket. There's a way to do it, like with golf and, and those types of things. But the biggest thing, of course, is the money. That it's suddenly, the decision was made in the 90s that this was going to become an exclusive. We need to copy the AAU basketball model, and we're going to make it a traveling game. And there's no longer going to be a lot of public infrastructure in terms of the public schools. And the teams themselves, to Amin's point about the capitalism piece of it, now we're going to have academies. And now it's going to become an elite high-level training sport, which is not basketball. Basketball, basketball becomes an elite sport when you need competition, because you start to play against a higher level of player. But the game itself is still extremely accessible at every level of class.
Yep. And and I think one of the...
But you don't think so? I mean, you say it should be. Is that getting away, do you think?
I do. I think we're in a place now where, and God, I wish I remember which reporter did it, but it was on HBO Real Sports, and they were talking about the proliferation of these sports complexes in places like Indiana and Nebraska, middle of nowhere America, but they'll put like multi-million-dollar sports complexes. Then they'll hold all these AU tournaments and flag football and soccer and that, like what you name it, and it's all built off of the intense, increasing desire of parents to raise children that are going to be professional athletes.
The legacy of Tiger Woods. If we're going to use the word legacy properly, once again, the Tiger Woods, Earl Woods, going on Mike Douglas, talking about how he had raised Tiger to be an athlete. And that is an incredibly important moment in the history of sports. And you had especially the dads out there, right? I can make him what I couldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And now there's an industry here.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are willing to pay for private lessons.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a pickup game anymore. And that goes back to the beginning of this piece about the decisions that get made. Go ahead, Amin.
No, I was going to say, I remember watching a documentary called In Search of Greatness, and they talked to Pele, and they talked to Wayne Gretzky, and they talked to, Jerry Rice, just people that are like undisputed the greatest who ever played their sport or their position. And one of the things that really jumped out was almost every athlete they spoke to said, when you grow up, how much intense training, year-round training did you do for that sport, right? So take Gretzky, for example. Like, you must have played hockey every day. And he said, no. As soon as hockey season was over, I threw my pads down and my stick down, I grabbed my mitt. I wanted to be I wanted to be a baseball player. And so, there was a time where, people learned how to play through the improvisation, through going out and playing, and then playing something else, and then taking something from what you did over here to this place over there. And now, again, the big business is to pay someone to coach my 11-year-old on the mechanics of a jump shot.
There's even a market. There's even a market for that organic thing that we all did as kids, which was to play different sports, and they call it cross training, right? There's a business model for all of it now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you're both getting at, and it's a concept called free play, which I'm sure, possibly you've heard of, and it's not just about sports, although it's usually applied to sports, but it can be open to capture the flag or any neighborhood game you play, including pickup basketball, including pickup baseball, soccer. And it's been on the decline for a generation in the US. And some of it can be attributed to like the 1970s and 80s, the fear in our local news that there was like more murders taking place. So like kids wouldn't be out playing in their neighborhoods the way they used to be. But you can clearly see the impact in sports. And people have suggested that it also impacts kids like anxiety and depression levels, because when you're like out playing in the neighborhood, you learn a lot of valuable life lessons. You know, when you get picked in the game, whether you get knocked down, how you're going to react. Like these are all things as a kid there's some of the first times you're facing these social responses and these internal responses that you're having. But to the point of specification and sports, there's so few kids now who are able to free play and go, you know, play pickup for years and years and years. They have a personal trainer or they're on some organized team run by parents in like first or second grade. And I don't think that we can't necessarily say that we know that that's like the worst thing that ever happened to sports. But to your point, I mean, like you can toss in all kinds of athletes like Alex Morgan as well, didn't start playing soccer until she was in high school. And yet you've got everybody chasing, not everybody, but so many parents chasing that Tiger Woods model, thinking that we have to like at every step of the way, we have to be able to like shepherd our kids toward the destiny we want them.
But to kind of bring it all back to the piece that opened it, these are the unintended consequences of decisions, right? So you make a decision that, you know, my child or children need to have more structured kind of institutionalized learning of stuff rather than just going out and playing. And as a result, we end up in a place where there is an industry, a cottage industry that's popped up where it exploits that desire and that need, and it begins to exclude those who cannot afford that industry's going rates. It's not that dissimilar from, hey, if you make a rule saying that women can't play, well, surprise, surprise, maybe the game is not going to be as developed 50 years later as it could have been if you had just let them do it.
Yeah.
Well, and the same thing happens. I'm sorry, Kate. And the same thing happens when you have intended consequences. For example, there's a reason why China has gone 1,000% into tennis. One, using sports to develop athletes and also to cover their human rights violations as such and everything else. But the other thing is that industry, when take Li Na, for example, became a great player, the government decided, just as it was decided that women weren't going to be able to use fields in England, we're going 100% in on the female tennis player in China. There are no male Chinese tennis players in the top 100. Female tennis players, there's a ton of them. And so, once again, the decision-making creates the athlete or creates the interest.
And
go ahead, Kate.
I was going to say, and then a thing that I think is true of what you just said, and then also is true of the FA piece, is that once all of these decisions have been made in the moment, and when you're living through them, I didn't live through the FA ban, but if I did, I would recognize, oh, this is going to impact women's football, just like Howard, you're saying, okay, China's going all in on women's tennis. That's why they have more women's tennis players. 40 years from now, we will just justify whatever exists. We're like, oh, women's soccer in England, people just don't like it that much. It's because it's not as fast.
Well, what are we hearing with black kids now? Well, they just prefer basketball and football over baseball, which is why they don't play. No, that's not the reason why they don't play.
Yes.
The reason why they don't play is that you need $3,000 now to join a league.
Yep. And in the same way, I mean, just like your point being like, okay, 40 years from now, I'll be like, oh yeah, we'll just justify it. Well, the female body in China is more conducive to tennis than other nationalities, where we're like, oh no,
got a longer tendon on the forehand.
No.
Exactly. And whereas you're like, no, actually, like human decisions every step along the way, influenced by politics, culture, geography, like have led us to there is nothing inevitable about the way sports look. These
That's
are
right.
choices.